Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Julia Keller and Heidi Stevens. Thanks for joining us. FAN celebrates its 40th anniversary this year, and we're honored to have the robust support of dozens of schools, nonprofits, corporations, families, and individuals from across the country. We are committed to our vision of an informed and compassionate community, and will achieve that vision by presenting fresh ideas that elevate minds, expand hearts, and make the world a better place. We have hundreds of videos of past events archived on our YouTube channel, so be sure to subscribe to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Julia Keller is a Pulitzer-prize winning journalist, novelist, and playwright. She has a Ph.D. in English literature from The Ohio State University and has taught at Princeton, the University of Chicago, and the University of Notre Dame, and she was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. Julia was the chief book critic at the Chicago Tribune for many years before quitting the world of daily journalism to write books. She was born and raised in West Virginia, the setting for her critically acclaimed 8-volume mystery series, and currently resides in Ohio. Heidi Stevens is a Chicago-based writer and the director of external affairs for the University of Chicago's TMW Center for Early Learning and Public Health, which works to provide parents, caregivers, and communities the knowledge and tools to optimize foundational brain development in all children. Prior to joining the University of Chicago, Heidi worked at the Chicago Tribune for 23 years, where she wrote a daily column called Balancing Act, and she was awarded the Ann Keegan Award for Distinguished Journalism in 2018. She still writes a weekly, nationally syndicated column. She has served on the FAN Board of Directors since September of 2021. And now let's welcome Julia Keller and Heidi Stevens to FAN.
Julia,
Hello.
so good to see you.
Yes, you were at the Tribune for 23 years. I was surprised. I didn't
know.
that long. No, it's quite wonderful.
It
It flew by.
It flew by, right? Totally. Okay, let's start the evening by level setting a little bit. Level set is a term that I learned when I left the newsroom. Is that a term you're using in your new world? Level set?
No, I've never heard it. Tell me.
Okay, so you are not a life coach, you are not a clinical psychologist, you're not necessarily here to offer us advice and guidance on when we should quit the thing, the job, the marriage, the church we've belonged to our entire lives, which isn't to say we can't talk about that, but I felt as I was reading your book that it was more of a meditation on the sort of underrated value of quitting and maybe why we've rated so much morality onto our refusal to quit and just sort of like where quitting fits into the culture and how it got that way. Is that fair to say?
Yes. I know what you're getting at as well, because I do often get questions about, should I quit this or that? Should I leave medical school, grad school? I made a joke. I was giving a talk the other day and I said, it's not as if I recommend that you, when you're pulling into your driveway tonight, when you go home, you text your spouse or your partner and say, sorry, honey, I'm out. No, that's not really, that's not what we're getting at here. However, I am known as a somewhat bossy person. So if there is a power vacuum, I'm perfectly willing to fill it. But no, to your point, I love that word meditation. That's one we really didn't use a lot in the newsroom because it sounded a little highfalutin. Right. But I do think that the best books and the kind I enjoy and the kind that I hope that I write are kind of taking a topic that we think we know everything about and thinking about them a little more deeply and relating them to our own lives, the lives of people we know, the lives of people we read about, the great biographies, formal biographies, and just the life stories we know of people we admire in the world today, and trying to find analogs between our lives and the lives of people who maybe achievements we aspire to ourselves. So I'm glad you said that. And yet there are some tips, and as you know from having read the book, Heidi, there are some definite tips in there that people can take away, I hope, and it does give them maybe just a little bit of guidance.
Yeah, I absolutely felt that way as I was reading it. So, okay, diving in. The book opens with you sobbing on a grimy linoleum floor of a studio apartment in West Virginia. I think, are you 19?
19
the
years
time?
old.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Grad
Take us there.
school. Yeah, it's I say grad school. In fact, I got the copy editors for the book, the publishing company said, I think there's a misprint here because you say you're 19. No, I was 19 and I was in grad school. I graduated from college early, not because I was some great intellectual prodigy. I just had taken the right courses at the right time, and then off I went. It just was kind of like a little bit of a sort of an accident of course scheduling. I was far from brilliant. So I was 19 years old, a grad student, but I had the emotional maturity of probably about a third grader. I mean, it was amazing to me looking back on it, how I thought this ever would have worked. So I was away from home for the first time. It clearly wasn't working. I probably was in the most dire, tumultuous emotional straits of my life. I remember just sitting there thinking, I can't, but I didn't want to quit. I look back on that now and I think of that emotion. I mean, my mind, my heart, my spirit, my body, everything telling me this is not right. Get out of here. And yet I resisted, and I was terrified to call home and say to my father, I can't do this. I was sobbing because he's a math professor himself. He certainly believed that you need to challenge yourself. And to my utter surprise, I don't know he heard something in my voice. He said, it's a 3-hour drive to Morgantown, West Virginia. I'll be there in 3 hours. And it came, picked me up, took me home. And looking back on it, that really was kind of the making of me. That just wasn't the right place to be at the right time. And I was able to kind of reorient my life in another direction. Had he not come, I don't know. I've never quite been in that terrible of a place since then. And I hope to never be again. But we all have those moments. And that kind of was when I first started thinking about quitting. Later on, I read the book Quitting The Grit by Angela Duckworth that you and I have talked about. And that was another kind of nudge in the direction to maybe take another look at this giving up, this idea of quitting. Why is it that calling somebody a quitter is such a terrible insult? Why? Just interrogating that.
And also interrogating who exactly you're afraid to quit for, right? Because I mean, I'm thinking about the fact that, that call to your dad had to be so difficult, and sitting on that linoleum floor, you probably knew in that moment that nothing about that situation was right for you, but there you are weighing that against who else that situation is right for, right? Like, they gave me this amazing opportunity. Who am I to turn it down? My parents are so proud of me. Am I going to disappoint them? Like, all of the people that you're going to disappoint when you quit, I feel like that's a very common thing all of us butt up against, right? Not, is this okay for me, but is it okay for all the other people in my circle if I quit?
How is it going to look? How is it going to
look?
Yes. And as you say, all the people you're going to disappoint. As I have a chapter in the book called Quitter's Guilt, that feeling you have when you're letting everybody down. I mean, leaving a relationship, leaving a marriage. I mean, we all know people that just go through a terrible ordeal because they know people are going to say, particularly if it's not awful. If it's an awful situation, sure, anybody can leave. We all know. I mean, right. If you're being kidnapped, you try to escape, it's a bad situation, you quit.
Yeah.
But if it's not awful, what do you do then? But it's not what you really want. And that's where it's really tough
where it's really tough.
How do you find the courage to do that? And it is courage. And I think of it too, it takes an imaginative leap as well, because to me, quitting is about abundance. You have to believe in something better on the other side. And part of my problem was that night in Morgantown, West Virginia, was I didn't believe there was anything, what was going to be on the other side. I just didn't know. I mean, I was completely bereft. I was at the end of my emotional tether. And I thought, what can possibly be beyond this? This is just such a terrible thing. And as you say, things like fellowships and jobs, and when you've been given an opportunity by someone, you have all that burden of knowing that somebody has believed in you and given you this opportunity, and you're turning your back on it. You're ungrateful, which is something, a word, thrown at women a lot. You're ungrateful. What's the matter with you?
Yeah. So interesting, because the book really puts humans in almost a unique category around some of that. You write about how our animal instincts are really guided by this one simple evolutionary principle, right? And that the best way to survive is to give up on whatever's not contributing to your survival, right? And so you want to waste as few resources as possible on the things that are ineffective. And yet, we as a species are not great at tuning that out. Other species are better. I wonder if you could talk for a minute about the finches on the Galapagos Islands, because that to me was such a light bulb, like, whoa, that's fascinating moment of the book.
Yes, I really wanted to include the science part of this because as it happens, animals in the wild quit all the time. Quit is a survival strategy, hence, the subtitle, a life strategy.
Yeah.
The finches on Galapagos, their food source is a weed called a caltrop, and it has a very tough hide. There's a little seed inside, and they have to dig at it with their beaks. Many people know the Pulitzer-prize winning book by Jonathan Weiner, The Beak of the Finch. The finches would evolve different beaks to operate against it to be able to dig out these seeds. If a finch spends too long digging out a particular seed, the bird will perish. Birds are very small. They have to get a nutritional payoff for this energy expenditure. And so what we know from contemporary science is that the ability to quit, the ability to know when, all right, this is not getting me anywhere, I need to change my focus here, I need to change, is something that animals do all the time because they aren't burdened with what I think of as sort of the cultural stuff that we've heaped up on top of quitting. We put this moral judgment on it. We think of it as the nuclear option. If you're going to quit, it's like the last refuge of the loser. It's what bums do. It's what lazy people do, is to quit. But in the animal kingdom, they don't have that. Of course, they don't have social media. They don't have the scolding emojis. They have nothing.
They don't
like
have class reunions.
Class reunions. Oh, that's great. Exactly. But we do this to ourselves. And I think that if we take the cultural part of it away and we see that we all know in our mind and heart and spirit when it's time to go, when we need to stop. I use examples too, these tragic stories of some athletes who have pushed themselves past where they should have, when your body sends you signals of when to quit. I mean, our bodies are very smart. They tell us things, but of course we end up not listening to the message, and we override what we're being told. Our cultural, our cultural upbringing does that for us. It kind of gets in the way and we don't listen to ourselves.
When and how did that start? Because social media is new-ish on the spectrum of the morality we've layered onto quitting, right? I mean, I feel like it dates back centuries. Is that right?
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
I mean, one place I think it began was in the middle of the 19th century when a man named Samuel Smiles, which is a kind of a funny name, but that was his real name. He was a Scot. He'd done a lot of things in his life. He happened upon this idea. He wrote short biographical portraits of notable men of the day. And of course, it was all men back then because only men could do interesting things, right? And they were engineers and authors and poets and potters and entrepreneurs and wealthy people. And he published a book, and he coined the term self-help. And the subtitle was "With Illustrations of Character and Conduct." And Smiles's idea was, and it sort of started the idea in the world, was that people who worked hard and who did not quit, they would rise and achieve great success. And anyone who was poor and downtrodden had not achieved success. If you were a big failure in life, it had to be because you had quit. Now, at this time, of course, it was the time of the Industrial Revolution, when income inequality was first really becoming pronounced. I mean, in centuries before that, it was very easy to tell who was going to rise. I mean, you were born to wealth. You were born to wealth and privilege. It was all inherited wealth. And if you were born a duke or a duchess, then you did well. But in the 19th century, it became a matter of it was a little more egalitarian because you had more people achieving great wealth. And how do you, if you're a decent person and you look at this vast disparity, people who are dying in the streets and then other people who are living in great palaces, how do you reconcile that in your own mind? If you're a caring person. And this was the way Smiles came up with, and the book was a huge hit, was the idea of it's individual effort.
Yeah.
And putting individual effort as being, that's the difference between the people that achieve great things and those who don't. And I maintain in my book a sort of a meditation, again, to use your lovely word, on how insidious that idea really is, because it implies that everything in your life and in your world is up to you. It ignores the fact that many people are born poor or female or Black or brown in a predominantly white culture. People are born with intellectual and physical and psychiatric disabilities. People are born to undocumented parents or don't know their parents, or, I mean, all these different ways we're born with all different abilities and all different life situations. But the self-help movement says, no, it's none of that. It's what you do. So again, a lot of this is a lot of generalities in there, but I do think that we see a lot of the issues in the world today come back to this idea of it's all up to the individual. And we become very, very judgmental about people who are not among, the 1%. And income inequality has only gotten worse, of course, as we know, in the present day. And if you complain about it or point it out, it's like, but it's because you didn't work hard. Those people if they just worked harder, then they would rise as well. I mean, we just see that kind of judgmental scolding in so many aspects of our life today. And it's as I said, really quite insidious, and I think really kind of negative, and it doesn't really help us at all.
Yeah. Such interesting context to put next to this conversation, not next to, weave it into this conversation. I think you have a line in the book where you say that to hold people responsible for their life situation without taking into account the specifics of their struggles and to stigmatize them for quitting allows an unjust world to flourish. I wondered as I was reading that if you would even take it a step further. I think that is that even at the heart of why we stigmatize quitting, right? You talk about how we sell grit to people the way we sell cars and cornflakes and smartphones. That, grit it's a product, right? It's an ideal and a product. Do you think that part of the reason we stigmatize quitting is to sort of prop up this just world fallacy?
Boy, I think so. One of the interviews I did was with Adam Grant, the wonderful TED Talk impresario and author of many best-selling books, and a really, really thoughtful man. I really enjoyed my conversation with him. And that's exactly what he said. He said, holding up hard work as a key to success allows us to rationalize inequality and to maintain our belief in a just world. And we all know it just isn't. Things happen. Hurricanes happen. Tornadoes happen. As I mentioned, people are born with disabilities that they overcome. Things just happen. It's just, we know that that life is filled with all kinds of events that we can't control. We control our reaction to them, but we can't control the events themselves. And it really does allow us to maintain inequality and to kind of feel okay with it. If you once you get to that point when you say, well, it's individual effort. There's a book I quote in there by a wonderful professor at Fordham, Self-Help Inc. And it's about how particularly the self-help movement has been so detrimental to women, not recognizing the unique circumstances of, to look at a single mother that is working a minimum wage job and saying, well, she just worked harder, she wouldn't be living in that crummy trailer, and her kids wouldn't be having Cheetos for dinner every night. And just that I just see it everywhere in a lot of our writing, and a lot of our sort of cultural narrative is all about this judgmental scolding of people who are somehow responsible for their own lack of success in the world.
Yeah. You talked a few minutes ago about athletes, and you write in the book that, some athletes don't know the difference between pain that they should push past and pain that they should pay attention to, right? And again, you're not a life coach, and you're not necessarily here to dole out advice, and yet you interviewed tons of people from the book, and I wonder if you picked up on a common thread or any themes that would help us discern the difference between the two, right? Between the pain you should push past as an athlete, as a parent, as a spouse, as an employee, and the pain that you should pay attention to.
Yeah, I did include many, many, many people's stories. Like that was what, to me, I mean, I enjoy all the sort of cultural reading and interviewing wonderful, thoughtful people like Adam Grant, but it's just in talking with, talked about 150 to 200 real people, that's always a funny phrase to me, like ordinary people, real people like me and you.
Not CGI people.
Right. They really exist. But that's the part I really, really love, is people asking them about their lives. And what came across in interview after interview, with a lot of variations in circumstance and people's life choices. But what really came across is people so much more regret the things that they should have quit but didn't, than the things that they did.
Wow.
There is this idea about that we regret quitting. Oh, if only I'd stuck with this. But over and over and over again, people would say, if I'd only stuck with, or if I only hadn't stuck with a particular thing, if I'd changed when I knew I should have. I gave a little talk at a senior citizens group, and at first these people were like, they were downright hostile. I mean, they would really, they even before the event began, some of these older people came up to me and just said, I've always been known as a gritty, resilient person. I can't believe that you're saying that I should have quit. But they sort of began to unwind a little bit, as the evening went on. And then invariably the same people that were very offended that I was saying that maybe grit wasn't a great quality to have, that maybe it was kind of the opposite, that grit kept us from where we needed to go. Times when we should have quit, we should have been more nimble and flexible. They would tell these just incredible stories about changes they had made in their life and what it had meant to them. One woman had trained as a nurse, and she said, first day on the job, and I realized this is not for me. I can't do this. I can't do this for the next 40 years. So she disappointed her family, completely disappointed her husband. Everyone thought she was crazy. And she became a teacher instead, rather than a nurse. And she said, I can't even imagine what my life would have been like if I had stuck with that. She said, it just wasn't for me. And I knew right away. I mean, we all know, that's the other thing that came across in people's stories, is when we listen, you hear. When you know, you know. Yeah. And it sounds a little corny, but truly, people up and down the ladder, in all different aspects of life would say they just knew, they felt it. And when you feel it and you ignore it, that's when perhaps, you really get off the track of your own life and you lose the thread of yourself.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about white flag moments, because those pop up throughout the book.
Yeah, I did that because I love reading that. Any book that I'm reading, I love when they have like little other aspects set aside. Maybe we get that from our newspaper background. We're always trying to find different points of entry in a story. We would always sidebar. Exactly right. Well, could you do a sidebar on that? Right. I love those. That's how we read now. We kind of, we're used to being interrupted. So we sort of interrupt ourselves when we're reading.
I love that.
And it was, I would just ask a variety of people, some people just in all walks of life. I mentioned in the book, it's people that I would talk to at the dog park, or, I mean, literally, I would just strike up conversations with strangers all the time. Now, sometimes people think you're probably crazy and you're going to ask them for money, but.
Did you ever ask them for money?
Well, if they see,
look, I'm an author.
Right, really, this has been a great conversation, but by the way, do you have $20? No, I would ask them, just tell me a quitting story. And everybody has one. Everybody has a quitting story. It just would be amazing to me how even people who would start out and say, well, I don't know, I've never really, well, no, now there was that time that and they would have some great stories. So a lot of these I would distill into this, trying to find that one moment when I mentioned that people know, when you just know, I've got to leave. But I should emphasize, to your earlier point about, what was it called? Level setting? Yeah. It doesn't mean, and in the life advice category, it doesn't mean it always worked out. These stories don't always end with, and then everything was great. I mean, in my own story that I mentioned, I left graduate school at 19. I went home. Everything didn't immediately work out. There was a very, very sort of strange, rocky, twisted road to where I eventually ended up. And I had to quit a few more jobs, always with the same total panic, sick to my stomach, terrible headache, had to, lie in bed for 3 days thinking, what have I done? So it's not that it always works out. That's never the ending. The happily ever after is not a part of this, but it's a matter of the constant quitting your way to resilience is how I like to think of it. When you do make those changes, and your resilience is in the number of times that you quit. It's in the cognitive flexibility. I mean, our brains sort of crave that. Our brains crave change. That nothing a brain hates more is than a static situation, just being and not changing. So the white flag moments were a way of enumerating these times when people would make changes. And I find that very inspiring. I mean, I loved hearing the stories myself, and I would be, well, what happened then? And then, and how did you know?
Yeah.
And some of them were taken from my reading. There's a long distance swimmer, and her story I found quite fascinating, where she had to quit or she was going to die. I mean, it was a life or death moment for her.
Yeah.
And but for other people, it was a lesser thing. It was just like maybe being in the middle of a job on a, in the middle of a winter afternoon, and realizing this is not where I want to be. This is not what I want to do.
Yeah. Tell the story about the Navy SEAL. He stepped on a landmine on patrol in Afghanistan, and I don't know that I would have framed what he did as quitting, and yet when you did, I thought spot on and brilliant. Talk about that.
Yeah, I that's another thing I want to do, is kind of expand our definition of what we mean by quitting. Right now, quitting kind of means like, okay, I'm mad at you, so I'm gonna if we're playing a baseball game, I'm gonna throw the bat down, I'm gonna go home, and you're never gonna see me again. We think of quitting as this one thing, when really though it's quitting a way of living your life, a way of approaching your life. And in his case, he was severely, grievously injured. And I just loved I was reading his story. One thing he said was, during his Navy SEAL training, when he was this whole, beautiful specimen of an American military officer, he said, you have these big grandiose goals. It's like, I'm a Navy SEAL and I'm going to do this, I'm going to finish this training. But after he was injured, he discovered that it was the opposite. The big grandiose goals no longer served him. So when I talked about him quitting, one of the things that he quit was seeing his life in terms of these big, almost kind of operatically, I am this military officer, and I am brave, and I am true, and I am strong. He could no longer do that. He was, missing his legs, and he'd been severely injured. He talked about even getting to the end of the next hour of his physical therapy that went on for many years, and multiple surgeries. He said he had to quit one way of being in the world and embrace another way, a way that meant the smaller incremental victory was what he had to look upon as the goal. And that's also what I mean by quitting. It often means quitting a way of being in the world, and I've had to do that several times. I mean, you and I've talked about, working for the Chicago Tribune when we did, which was really a kind of a glorious time for newspapers.
Yeah.
And we had to come to some accommodation for the fact that newspapers are struggling and newspapers are not what they were. And so our lives had to change. We had to change our definition of what is a worthwhile life, as writers, as thinkers, as good people in the world. How are we going to accomplish that now that that's no longer possible for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk for a minute about when you're helping someone else come to these decisions, right? I know you write a little bit in the book, and I know The Guardian interviewed you about this, when, for example, we're helping our children decide when to quit, right? Are we suddenly indulging them and raising quitters who, is this decision going to come back to haunt them over and over and over? Or did we teach them to honor their inner voice and leave something when it's unhealthy? I mean, where do you fall on that? And how do you talk to parents or friends or anyone really who's trying to decide, like, but how do I help guide someone else through that process?
I think it's just crucial, because we are, of course, more than just ourselves. As you say, we're parents, we're partners, we're friends, we're citizens, we're all these things we want to be, neighbors and colleagues. One thing I talk about in the book, I have a chapter called The Quasi Quit, which is not having to quit everything all at once, not having to have the grand renunciation, where you throw down the scepter and say, I hereby renounce my throne. I mean, it doesn't have to be that moment. That moment is kind of nice. It's kind of a nice movie moment. I talk about the movie Office Space when Jennifer Aniston quit. Yeah. We all love that. I mean, wouldn't that be wonderful? I mean, I always had dreams of doing that. I remember one day I was really mad. I was really mad at the Tribune once, and I actually did walk out. I didn't quit, but I almost quit. And the one editor kept calling me.
Did you walk to the Gap? Where'd you walk?
Well, actually, I walked to TJ Maxx.
Perfect.
It's funny you say that. The Gap. I just went in the other direction across Michigan Avenue. I
Got
did.
it. Yeah.
I shopped for a little bit.
Oh,
The editor kept trying to call me.
perfect.
I wouldn't take his calls. I kept clicking it out. And then finally I just thought, all right, I'm being silly. I'm being childish. However, it was a righteous cause, I have to say.
I'm sure it was.
Something that the copy desk had done that he didn't back me up on. But in any case, I've forgotten completely about it, of course. See, all these years
Clearly.
later.
Clearly.
But the quasi quit means you quit. I think of quitting as a rheostat dial, right? You can have a light
Yeah.
on a rheostat dial, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be an on-off switch. It can be a rheostat
Mm.
dial. There are things you can do that are on your way to getting to another place that don't have to involve, as I said, that grand renunciation and that walking out with a with a lot of fancy music in the back.
Fanfare and yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, the flourish of trumpets and all that. You
Yeah.
can kind of get your way towards something. You can change a situation enough so that you can endure it. So the quasi quit is one way you can do that. But in
Mm.
terms of parents and children, that's something I really wanted to get at in the book. I mean, I don't have children, but I have nieces and nephews, and they've wanted to quit things along the way. And I would interviewed a lot of teachers and a lot of parents about that. I talked to you, Heidi. I mean, you're in the book.
Mm.
Because I'd wondered, I mean, I knew both of your kids are athletes. And I knew that you had been, an athlete and a musician in your youth. And it was like, so how do you negotiate that as a parent? When do you let them
Yeah.
quit?
Mm.
And I interviewed a couple of teachers who were just wonderful. I'd heard that they had been really tough teachers. And I loved their answer because I was sure that when I asked them about quitting, they were going to say, I was ready. I had my little notebook and pen out. I was sure they were going to say, you have to stick with things. You can't let kids quit. And to my great surprise and delight, neither one of them said that at all. They said, oh no, it's completely up to the individual child. You have to let exactly what I had written about. You have to let people come to it on their own. The teacher who I'd been told it was like the toughest middle school teacher, and she taught in Texas and Japan and Germany, taught around the world. And she just said, oh no, it's never a one size fits all. Every child is completely different. There are some kids who will actually harm themselves and sticking with something long past when they should. And yet there are others, though, that you do need to just nudge a little bit and say, all right, let's figure out how we can make this work. It was all about how can we make this work given your particular gifts, talents, interests, to use it to craft your quitting or not quitting strategy according to who the person is, according to the individual. Now that takes time. It takes effort.
Yeah.
You have to be a really dedicated teacher and a really loving and attentive parent to make that work. Yeah, you have to take the time and do it. There is no one size fits all. Don't quit or yes, quit, or it's very individual. It's that crafting.
So interesting. And maybe getting at the heart of what it is that's making you want to quit, right? Is it just that you lost, which feels like maybe a emotion to get used to, since that'll serve you well? Or is it more that, I don't feel like myself when I'm doing this thing, which feels more like, yeah, maybe you do quit then.
Right. Or sometimes it is just kind of a laziness. I mean, I did eventually, it's funny, I talk about leaving grad school. I did. Years later, I did go back and I did get a PhD. And there was a moment when I was ready to quit. You have to do two languages, and one of my languages was German. And there came this one night when I had a big translation due the next day. The way it was like a tutorial, you sit down with the teacher, the German professor, and I would read my translation, and I'd be going, and she'd say, wait, and then she'd correct me. So I had to translate these great gobs of German literature. And I remember I just had this spasm of total laziness. It happens. And I just thought, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to quit the whole thing. I really was ready to completely throw the whole thing out the window. I just didn't want to do it. And I remember the moment I made the decision, that's it, I'm going to quit. And I remember put a couple of frozen waffles in the toaster. And I said, that's it. I'm just not going to do that translation. And my entire graduate school career was hanging by a thread, unbeknownst to me. And I wasn't going to do it. I was going to go first thing the next morning and just withdraw from that class, withdraw from school. It was all over. This is going to sound like a very peculiar story, but this actually did happen. And the next morning, I was getting ready to call the professor. My phone rang and she said, I've had an illness in my family. I've been called away, so I won't be able to meet with you today. So you can have an extra week to do your translation. Wow. So, and then it was either a sign from the heavens or just dumb luck. Yeah. So eating the frozen waffle in lieu of doing the German assignment ended up being a very smart strategy because that spasm of laziness kind of passed. But I was ready to quit. I was at that moment. And it wouldn't have been the right thing to do then. I only tell that story because it's true, for one thing, and also just that you don't know what's going to happen, when you make certain decisions in life, good ones and bad ones, and you can only do the next thing that feels right. But I was very, very close, and I would never have finished my grad school education. Somehow the frozen waffle seems at the center of that story. I don't know why.
Absolutely. It's the part I'm going to remember. That's going to be the flashbulb moment, the waffle. Put a little toaster lever down. So is there a moment where a person goes from being sort of a discerning judge of what's working and what's not to being a quitter? I mean, if you left one bad marriage, like, fine, you have a, high sense of, you value your happiness and your well-being. If you leave two, if you leave three, if you don't hold a job for more than a year, if you're on your 11th job by 30, you know what I'm saying? Is that a sign of someone who is very good at quitting and their brain is, to your point, just will not tolerate inertia? It always is looking for the novel thing. Or, when does it go from something that's valuable to something that's a problem?
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question. Yeah. And again, I guess, you really do, one knows in one's own heart and mind when it something you said earlier about that when but it takes a level of attentiveness to what's going on inside you. I mean, we can lie to a lot of people, but it's very, very hard to lie to yourself, at least for a long period of time. And that, in your own mind, when you're doing that, when it's just for the novelty and just for the not being able to stick with it. But on the other hand, sometimes it does take a very long time to get to where you need to be. It does. I mean, it's not going to be the first or second or third thing. A woman I admired very much was Barbara Bush. I did, both her and George H.W. Bush. And she would talk about how, she met him when they were both very young. And she'd say, I married the first boy I ever kissed. And I remember hearing her say that. It was a nice story. And again, I admired her very much, but I'd think, well, good for you. But for a lot of people, it doesn't work out that way. The first person that they fall in love with ends up being a terrible person, being, an abusive spouse, but that's good for her, but that's not everybody's experience. That some people have to go through many, many, many relationships in order to get one that finally works. And you may be 80 before that works. I mean, in terms of relationships or jobs, or that there isn't any one template that works for every life. And that's another reason why I think the white flag moments in the book are kind of important, because what I'm trying to suggest in there is that everybody has their own individual journey to get there. I mean, I love to read biographies, and that's why, because every life has these moments and these times and these individual aspects of every life that make them what they need to be. And of course, in retrospect, everything looks inevitable, but it's all that variety, that dazzling variety of the ways to live a life that have always entranced me. There's a great line in Thomas Kenley that wrote the Schindler's List novel. He's a wonderful Australian novelist. He has another novel that's about these nurses in World War I, and they're leaving their tiny little village in Australia. And at the end of one chapter, he says, and they were just about to discover how many ways there are to live a life. And that's ultimately what quitting is about too, because it's like all these things you have to go through. Some of us find right away. Some people know right away. My sister and I used to laugh about people that, or admiringly, the dancer would talk about the first time she put on her toe shoes and think, I have found my life. And we would both laugh and say, like, when does that happen? When do you...
Right. Still looking.
I'm still looking. Exactly.
Right. You're in this book more than you are in your other books. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. And I was sort of uncomfortable with that, sort of, and then sort of not. And then I felt I had to kind of do that because I wanted it to be, these are the kind of book that I enjoy reading, which is a little bit memoir, not too much though, because then that seems a little self-indulgent. But I felt like I had to talk about my own life and times quitting. As I mentioned, I mean, quitting the Tribune was a huge ordeal. I remember I was just so You know how you always think that you're the most important person in the world? You probably don't think that, but I always think that, even though I'm not. Even
But you
far
actually
from it.
are. Yeah.
I keep waiting for that sign. But I remember when I went in and you talked to the editor at the time, and I just said, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is supposed to be so, I couldn't believe I was doing this. And it was such a huge step.
They'll have to shut
What am
down when I leave.
I was gonna say, right, what am I doing to the city of Chicago? How
All
can I
these
do
people
that?
will lose their jobs.
Exactly right. So much is on my shoulders. So I go in and I say, oh, I've decided to leave. And he said, oh, okay. Hey, well, listen, good luck to you, kid. Right. It was like, oh, okay.
Where's the
So,
rending of cloth?
there was
Right.
nothing. There was no, I was just, well,
Hilarious.
but it was, but we do have that feeling. So I wanted to include that, my own kind of quitting experience too. And as you know, the book is dedicated to my niece who passed away very young. And I wanted to put her in there as well, because she died of cancer at 33, just a couple of years ago. And she was one of these people who tried so many things in her life. It was just great. She was so adventurous, and much more so than I am. I mean, I'm a complete fraidy cat. I'm always, I just feel like my life has been a series of a kind of being a little bit afraid to do a great variety of things. But Annie Kate was just out there doing them, and to me, she's just a great example of somebody who never minded stopping one thing to do another, never saw it as a defeat. She was just out there, she'd majored in English, and then she thought, no, I want to go to law school. And no, I don't think I want to practice law. I think I want to work on immigrant right. And so, as I said, died quite young, 33, but in that packed so much into that. And to me, just a great example of what it's like to live your life, not worrying about what other people say or what other people think or the judgments other people make, but just live according to your own passions and your own delights and your own joys, and to keep going for the next thing and believing that it's always going to be better. It's always going to be better.
I think your niece's story is also such a beautiful distillation of why this book matters so much, and why conversations around quitting matter so much, and maybe even partly why you felt compelled to write it. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we don't know how long we have.
Very true. Very true. And I'm so struck by that. I keep thinking of myself at 33. Had I passed away at 33, I can't even, I mean, so many things have happened in my life subsequent to that particular age. When we look, age, of course, is just this, it's just a number, but it is a kind of it's a marker. It's a milepost, that tells us where we are along the way. And I quote a young British man that wrote, he also died quite young, and wrote a column in the London Guardian. And one line that he had in one of his final columns was, "A life, if lived well, is long enough." And you do think that if we do have this limited amount of time to be stuck in something that isn't working, that doesn't feel right, that we know doesn't feel right, that our mind and heart and spirit bodies giving us these signals isn't right, is really foolish and short-sighted, and is wasting this precious gift of our lives. So yeah, that definitely was a motivation in this. I don't know if I would have written it in quite this way had I not gone through that. My niece passed away in 2019 in September, and I had just finished the final novel in the mystery series, and I knew I wanted to write something nonfiction, but I wasn't quite sure what it was going to be. But when this came to me, I just thought it really kind of her life story kind of encapsulated what I was trying to get at in the book.
Your dad shows up in the book too, obviously in the beginning when you call him and he says, I can be there in 3 hours. But toward the end, you talk about how quitting in a way defined his life. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, when you say quitting, everybody immediately thinks you mean smoking or drugs or bad habits, we think about. And it's true. I mean, I think that quitting shadowed his life. He was a smoker, tried everything possible to quit smoking. He wasn't one of these people who was cavalier about it, not realizing the risks. And so it ended up defining our childhoods too. So the point I try to make is quitting is good and bad. I mean, we should obviously quit bad habits that aren't serving us. but if you can't quit them, that's kind of okay too. I mean, again, I guess this kind of non-judgmentalness is what, probably more felicitous way of saying that, but just to be a little more generous toward each other, a little kinder, to recognize that people pretty much do the best they can. I mean, I say this as a very judgmental person. Maybe it comes with the territory. You know, I was a critic for many years, and a literary critic and a TV critic and all this. And you get so used to stroking your chin, you know, and making all these judgments about people and their work, and to maybe stand back a little bit and just be a little kinder. And people go through incredible ordeals we know nothing about. I mean, you think of what we know among the people who are our friends and our family members, we know what they go through, and every stranger you meet is going through something. But it's the tendency to be judgmental, and these days more than ever, I think we're so just kind of, there's a kind of a meanness and a and again, this is complete self-reporting here. I mean, I do it as much as anybody does, and I keep trying to get a little better at that, about realizing what people are going through. And someone like my dad, who was said a very brilliant man, brilliant math professor, but really felt that smoking had really destroyed his life, and indeed it did. I mean, he died very young, died when he was 52. And I wish he had a much longer life. He certainly certainly deserved it.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I know that stuff's not easy to talk about, but
no, it isn't. It's funny. I think people think, those of us who are writers, and I'm sure you find this to be true as well, because you write from your heart as well about your own experiences. It isn't easy, and it doesn't get any easier when you do it. I kept thinking it was going to be good, so it's a lot easier, but oh, it's tough. It's really tough. I mean, and feeling you've been fair, particularly with family members. I always think, so what gives me the right? Why do I get to define the family? You know, I was on a TV thing one day, and I made some comment about my family, and my sister called me afterwards, and she said, "Oh, really?" You know, it's like, she was like, "Really? I see.
Yeah.
So your view gets to be the one that," I'm thinking like, well, kind of, yeah, because I'm
kind of, yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
but there's a lot of responsibility with that, and I'm sure you feel that as well, you know, because you write about you know, your own children and your own life, and you feel like you really want to get it right. And when it comes to emotions, I mean, getting it right has a whole different definition. It's not a math problem. It's
completely.
Have I really given this situation it's the full measure of its truth? And
right.
Yeah.
And should I even be doing this? Should I even be going there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how people do it when they write the real searing memoirs, and it's then you want to run away and hide, you know, after it's published.
Do you mind if we do a few audience questions?
Oh, of course. Yes. Here
Okay.
I've been nattering on. Yes.
No, this has been lovely. We have a lot of them though. Okay. So, I have not yet read your book. Totally normal. Just came out. Do you offer ways to handle the comments of others who feel the choice you made was inappropriate, i.e. visibly and verbally provide them with the courage of my own convictions that led to the choice to quit? So how do you handle the judgment?
Yeah, I think so. You know, one thing I should say too, the book also includes, I have several chapters on the neuroscience of quitting and of change, and when our brains make a decision to change and go another direction. So if someone is criticizing you for going another direction, feel free to say, well, in chapter 2 of this new book that I read, actually some of the leading neurosciences of the scientists of the day will tell you that one of the most difficult things we ever ask our brains to do is to change, is to make what neuroscientists call stay or go decisions. There's all the interlocking webs of our 86 billion neurons, which is what the average human being has. All those are all in motion all the time, and they're all interacting with each other in these intricate, highly complex ways. So when you quit something, when you leave one path for another, you're asking your brain to do an enormously difficult and complex task. So if anybody is judgmental of you, I would just throw that right back up at them and say, well, perhaps you should take that up with your local neuroscientist, because I think what I'm doing is just fine.
I like that. I like that a lot. Okay. When I hear you speak of quitting, I can't help but think of quitting to avoid regrets, which is so interesting because you said most people say they regret not quitting sooner, but here I am hijacking the question. Okay. Quitting may be necessary to have the well-lived life you quoted earlier. Did you interview the dying? and to learn more about the value of quitting?
Well, there are people who've gone through great torments and some tumultuous times in there. Specifically, I guess in effect, I do in a couple of places. As I said, you could argue that. Yeah, I mean, I was around some people who were at the end of their life, because I think, if I'm interpreting your question right, you're asking about, when you get to a certain point at the end of your life, when you're looking back on it. I talk about the lives of some famous historical people too, and they're looking back on their lives too. So I guess their answer would be yes, sort of, and that might be, yeah. I mean, that would be an interesting way to look at it. On our deathbeds, what do we look back and regret? And as I mentioned, vast majority of people regretted times that they didn't quit things rather than when they did quit them. And that's unscientific, but that just the great preponderance of the people that I spoke with, that's really what they regretted, was times when they knew they should have quit earlier. A career, a job, a religious belief, a political belief. A lot of people have changed political beliefs recently.
Interesting. Are there some settings that look like quitting, leaving a job, changing majors, that are more changing settings? So we don't quit our guiding principles or personal mission, we quit some settings.
Oh, that
Interesting
sounds a little
reframe.
bit like what I was getting at with quasi quitting. I mean, you can change where you're doing something and maybe not the thing that you're doing, stay in the same field, but then be in another venue for it. So again, I think there are gradations of quitting. It doesn't have to be this great renunciation, as I mentioned. That's kind of a way to handle. They still be in the same general field, in terms of a job, or you can tailor an experience or a place where you are to better suit you. To kind of this gets into the kind of ask for what you want kind of idea. And I always thought that was a little bit corny when people would say, like, well, you have to name what you want. But it's true. I know times when I've been really upset. I have this one friend of mine who always say, so what do you really want? And I would come up with some highfalutin grandiose, and she always interrupts me and goes, no. What do you really want? Name it. And it's harder than it seems. So if you can name what you really want and change a situation so it's a little closer to that, it's difficult. It's harder than it seems.
Yeah. This one might be tough to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What are the signs we should look for to know that it's time to quit?
Well, that's why I think each white flag moment in there, in the book, is a different case where people saw different things. I talked to one man who knew when he was sitting in his job one day, and he realized for the first time in his life, he loved his job. He didn't want to be at his job. He looked at the clock and realized he wasn't going to get to his son's baseball game. I'm pointing at a clock. That's what I'm pointing at. And he said, I looked at the clock and I thought, I don't want to be here. I want to be at my son's birthday game or baseball game. His son played Little League. And he said, I knew then I don't want this job anymore. This job, he wasn't able to have regular hours, and he said, that was it for me. So it's different for everybody. And that's why I think the value of those white flag moments. And I love those anecdotes where people, what was it for them? I mentioned one woman who was in her boss's office, and she looked out, the boss had a window behind her. And she said, I looked out and I could see the skyline of Chicago. It was up in Evanston, and I could see the skyline of Chicago behind her. And I thought, I'm never going to see that skyline from that window ever again. I mean, that was her sign. She thought, that's it. I don't want to be here. I don't like this boss. I don't like this job. So for everybody, there was a different, I don't want to say triggering moment, because trigger has a whole nother meaning these days but this moment of change, this great moment when it's different for everybody. And that's why that to me is a value of those white flag moments, is you read other people's, and while it's not going to line up perfectly with yours, something in it might bring to mind the kind of situation you're dealing with too. We have those moments for everybody, and they're different, but there are the moments. They do exist when and it can be a small thing. It can be something visual, something auditory.
Revealing my quitting phobia here, this person says, but we can't just live self-centeredly with no consideration for the impact our choices have on others. We're also social creatures, and social groups don't persist without some concessions from individuals.
I completely agree. Yes, we are indeed. In fact, what I would argue is I think we are our best selves when we are making decisions based on, I mentioned those sort of internal messages that we have, the mind and the heart and the body and the spirit. That's when we're at our best. So it's the opposite of selfishness. Quitting is when you're doing what's right for you, you're doing what's right for a lot of other people too. A lot of people will say to me, well, I would quit, but I have this, have the husband, the wife, the kids, the mortgage, and all of that. And I would sort of turn that around. I'd say those are the reasons that you do want to make a change in your life if it doesn't feel right. They're not the reason you don't. They're the reason that you do. It's all about that feeling of abundance. Now, again, when I use words like abundance and hope, they sound a little corny and a little cheesy, but I speak as somebody who has a very dark core of intense cynicism that I have to overcome, to have written a book like this. I really did, because I've always tended to kind of see what they used to say about James Agee, he could x-ray a lover's smile and see a grinning skull. So, I was always one of those kind of people. The abundance and the hope part comes on the other side of the kind of cynicism and the darkness and the seeing always the bleaker side of things. But I truly believe that we do what's best for the world when we do what's best for ourselves. And that's the only way we do that, is by listening to ourselves and that attentiveness and listening to those around us. If you're responsible for children or perhaps older people you're taking care of, it's what you do at your best is when you're listening, doing that intense listening to yourself and to others. And but I do, as I mentioned at the outset, we quit our way to resilience. It's not the other way around. So we do what we do because of those other people, not despite them, and not because not ignoring them, but we do because of wanting to do right for other people.
I love that.
Heidi, thanks for a great interview. Julia, love how you answer questions as a nice, straight, clear, full sentences, quick. Appreciate it. I've sat through a lot of interviews over the 15 years, so I appreciate a solid one. Thank you so much. I want to remind everyone that both Heidi and Julia will be at After Hours today, which will start at 8:05 p.m. Anne Marie has been popping in commercials in chat. If you don't have chat open, go ahead and open it really quick. She'll pop in another one again. How do you come to After Hours? You buy a copy of this fabulous book from our partner bookseller, The Bookstall. They'll send you a receipt via email, and the link to register for After Hours will be in that. After Hours is a Zoom meeting, not a Zoom webinar, so you can ask your own questions, and chat is two-way. It's very lively. And so my guess is, I don't know if Julia still has actually, I'll ask you, Julia, do you still have a threshold to hear more quitting stories, or do you feel like
No, no. Love them. And I would encourage everyone to join us, because it is quite fascinating. Everybody has a quitting story. I will say that just without fear of hearing the opposite. Everyone has a quitting story, and they're always great.
Aw. Are they melancholy sometimes, I wonder?
Melancholy.
Or like a regret feeling? Is there regret sewn in somewhere?
No regrets, Lonnie. No regrets.
No regrets.
No regrets. No.
Interesting. All right. Heidi, thanks so much for another great interview. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Heidi.